Yeah. Shkoyach, Rabbi. Hilchos Geirushin Perek Chamishi, the laws of divorce, chapter 5. Essentially, what's happening in these chapters is the Rambam is using the verse in the Torah that describes divorce, and he's going through it word by word and explaining all the laws relevant to each concept. So, for example, it says, V'kosav lo, you have to write for her the divorce. So we spent the whole chapter on writing, and we spent the whole chapter on what it means for her, that you have to do it with the proper intent. Now the Rambam goes to the next words in the verse. Zeh shenemar b'Torah v'nosan biyada. Halacha Aleph. This that it says in the Torah that he should put it into her hand. That's a literal verse. You have to write the divorce and give it into her hand. Don't think that means, says the Rambam, ein inyan hakasuv ela shiyagia haget lo. The whole intent of the verse is that the divorce needs to reach her. Doesn't actually necessarily mean her hand. It needs to reach her, which means ve'echad yada, whether it's her hand, oy cheka, or her bosom, oy chatzeira, or even her courtyard. You can even put it into her property. Oy shlucha she'asasa yada ki yada, or an agent where she makes his hand like her hand. Hakrel echad hu, it's all one. In any of these cases, if you hand it over to her agent, you put it in her property, you put it into her bosom or into her hand, it's all good. And the truth is, her property could mean either her courtyard, which is owned by her, or a courtyard which she rents, or which she borrows. Who it's all considered to be her jurisdiction, her possession. And the moment that the divorce document will reach her property, she'll be divorced. Now, there is a caveat when it comes to property.
Exactly what I wanted to ask.
Okay, there is a caveat. It says the Rambam Halacha Beis. It's not so simple. You put it into her backyard, and she's on a trip somewhere else, and it's divorced. No. If you choose to throw a divorce document to your wife into her courtyard, if she was standing there near her courtyard, nisgarsha, that's when she gets divorced. But if not, lo nisgarsha. Just you putting it into her backyard doesn't help. She's not divorced. Until she stands near her property. There's some debate what this means. Either it means until she comes back. In other words, when she comes back, right away the divorce will go into effect. Or others say it means she has to be there when you throw it in. The point is she has to be able to see it. Even if it's a courtyard that's super guarded, barbed wire fence, no one's going to go in there. You put the document in there, it's not going anywhere. It's going to be very, very well guarded. Doesn't matter. She has to be there. Why does she have to be there? Because divorce is a liability, not a merit, not a privilege. We have a principle. We can only impose liability on you when you are present. When it comes to a merit, it's called the zechut, we say, Zachin la'adam shelo befanav. I can give you a merit even if you're not looking, even if you're not there. For example, classic example that happens all the time is the Eruv Tafshilin. If a holiday goes into Shabbat, you cannot cook on Friday for Shabbat unless you make an Eruv Tafshilin, before you put aside some food before the holiday. What if you forget? Somebody else can do it for you. The rabbi typically does it for the whole city. Even though nobody's in his house when he does it, but he gives everybody that merit, even if they're not there. Zachin la'adam shelo befanav. But chavin, putting liability on you, you have to be there watching. So when he puts the divorce into her, what's the liability? She cannot marry a Kohen anymore. She's going out of the marriage. So you can only do that if she's watching. Halacha Gimel. Okay, it's a bit of a cartoon picture, so just, take it with a grain of salt. But she's on the roof, and he is downstairs in his courtyard. Okay, the property belongs to him. The home upon which the roof is belongs to her. So she's on her roof, he's in his courtyard. And he throws the divorce against gravity. He throws it upwards to the roof. Once the divorce reaches the airspace of the fence around the roof, this is not a good roof because there's no fence. But ideally, when you have a roof, you're supposed to have a fence around it. So if there would be a fence around it, as soon as the divorce document reaches the airspace of those walls, or within 3 tvachim, within 3 handbreadths of space to the roof, nizgarsha, the divorce goes into effect. So long as it actually comes to rest later. But if it gets erased or burnt before it actually reaches the roof, even if it gets erased, let's say some water comes onto it or whatever it is, after it reached the airspace of the partitions, or after it reached the space of less than 3 handbreadths near the roof, for example, the wind blew it up and it got erased through water, or it burned through fire. Since in the end of the day it's not going to come to rest, it's not a good divorce, she's not divorced. But if it will come to rest, if by natural abilities it will come to rest, then the divorce goes into effect the moment that it reaches the airspace of the partitions or 3 tfachim within the rooftop space.
But she must be aware that he is sending her again.
Absolutely. She has to be aware of it. We don't think on chapter 1 she has to know that she's getting a divorce. She can't think she's getting something else. But we're assuming that all the other conditions are met. What if it's the opposite? So here he's working against gravity, right? Here he's throwing it upwards. What if it's this way? Hoya hagag shaloi v'humil mayla boy. The roof belongs to him. He's up top. V'himi lamata b'chatzer shalah. She's downstairs in her courtyard. V'zarak logita, and he throws the divorce document downwards. Kevan sheyatza haget mi mechitza sagak. Once the divorce leaves the partitions of the roof. Let's say there was a fence. Okay, again, bad picture, but there was a fence, okay? And he throws it out of the partition. And it reaches the airspace of the partitions where she is enclosed in. Nisgarsha, the divorce goes into effect right away. Different. See, here, as soon as it leaves his property, it becomes a good divorce. In the earlier case, it had to get into her property to become a divorce. Why? Because in the first case, you're going against gravity. Here you're going with gravity. So by default, when you throw it down, it's for sure going to come down. Halacha hey. What if you threw it into her property, into a place where it was for sure going to be destroyed? Let's say she was making a barbecue downstairs, and you chucked it into the fire. Or she had a little well, and you threw it into the water. Then ain't a get. It's not a divorce. Because even though it's in her property, but you threw it directly into a spot where it was going to get destroyed. And let's skip that word v'noch. We're going to delete that. If it reached her possession, and then a fire comes and burns it, he didn't throw it into the fire. He threw it into a good spot. And then the barbecue fire, went a little crazy and burnt up the divorce. Then it's a good divorce. Because when you threw it in a way it was going to land good. Only later it got burnt, so it's fine.
It should be handed into her hands carried.
By the way,
Or even by a messenger.
That is the custom today. Today the sages do not rely on courtyards. You must put it into your wife's hand or into her representative. But someone's got to be holding it. It's a good point. Halacha vav. Zarkoi al gabe kone oireimach hanautzim birshusa. If he throws it onto a reed or onto a spear sticking out in her property. Okay, so imagine this is the woman's courtyard. There's a spear sticking out. And as the commentaries explain it, this spear is higher than the walls of the fence around the property.
Put it on like an arrow, he shot an arrow and he threw a spear.
No. He threw the divorce onto and landed onto a spear. See? So it's in her property, but it's higher than her property, technically. It's not a divorce till it lands in a place where it could be guarded, in other words, in her actual property. If you have 2 courtyards, one enclosed by the other, one inside the other. The inner one belongs to her, the outer one belongs to him. The outer walls are higher than the inner walls. So if he throws the divorce document into this little compound, as soon as it goes within the airspace of the outer walls, which belongs to him, she's already divorced. Because the inner courtyard relies on the outer courtyard for its guarding, for its protection. And therefore, even though it only reached the airspace of the husband's courtyard, it hasn't yet gone down to the woman's courtyard, it's already divorced. We don't say the same thing when it comes to boxes. What do I mean by that? It says the Rambam Halacha Zayin Keitzad. What does that look like? You have 2 boxes. Okay, this is from top view. One inside the other. Here's a couple of boxes, but let's just imagine 2, okay? There's 2 boxes, one inside the other. The inner one belongs to the woman, the outer one belongs to the husband. And the commentaries say, both boxes are sitting in the husband's property. Husband's property, husband's outer box, wife's inner box. And he threw the divorce into the boxes. Afilu higia la'avera pnimis, here, even when it reaches the airspace of the inner courtyard, eina migureshes, she's still not divorced. Ad sheyonuach al tzad hakupa hapnimis, until it actually comes to rest on the surface of the inner box. Now, the rationale behind this principle is because when it comes to possession and vessels, we have a rule that just because something is in your vessel, if it's in somebody else's property, it doesn't become yours. So if you have a jug, and someone puts stuff in the jug, but it's in someone else's backyard, the assumption is the person doesn't want you to have their jug, to have your jug on their property, so whatever else is in your jug doesn't become yours. Same thing over here. Since it's in the husband's property, the assumption is that even though it's in the woman's box, since it's on his property, it doesn't go into effect. And therefore, the Rambam says, when am I saying that if it reaches the surface of the box, it is divorced? When do we say this? A very far-fetched case. The box is lying on its side and it has no bottom. So the box serves no purpose really, and therefore the husband wouldn't mind it being in his property. But if it has a bottom, then even if the divorce reaches the bottom of the woman's box, she's not divorced. The fact that a woman has a utensil in the property of the husband does not acquire the divorce for her, unless he isn't particular about its place. The default assumption is he objects to her having the box there, and therefore it cannot acquire for her. Therefore, only if it's on the side and there's no bottom and there's no actual purpose in the vessel, then it works. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Halacha ches. Zarak lagitav hi b'seich beisei b'seich chatzerei. You throw the woman a get, but she's in your house. She's in your courtyard. Eina migureshes ad shiagia haget liyada. Then she's not divorced unless the divorce reaches her actual hand. Or a small utensil which the husband wouldn't object to having in his property. It could go in sloichis, like a little jug or a little basket or something like that. Also, if it reaches her couch, she's sitting on a couch. If it was 10 handbreadths high from the ground, it's kind of its own little area. She's then divorced. Because in this case, she has designated a separate domain for herself. And the husband doesn't object to the fact that the couch has legs that are sitting on his property. It doesn't matter, as long as it's her couch, he doesn't mind, and the divorce goes into effect. If a husband lends a space to his wife in his courtyard, he doesn't say clearly which space it is. He says, you have a space. You can own some space in my courtyard. If he designated it to her, then of course it has to reach that spot. But if he didn't designate it, and he throws her a divorce while she's standing in his backyard, and it reaches the area of 4 cubits around her, about 6 feet around her, she is divorced. We have a principle in halacha that says, arba amot shel adam konot lo. A person's 4 cubits become like his possession wherever he is by default. So since over here the husband allowed her to have a space in his courtyard, we give her that full space of 4 amot around her, and if it reaches that space, she's divorced. What if it landed there, it landed in a space that was close to her, and then nisgalgel v'nafal, it rolled away, and fell al gabe koira al gabe sala rachak mimena, on top of a wooden beam or a rock, which is now further removed from her. So the Rambam says, im hamakim shenafal olav, ein bayarba amis al arba amis. If the beam or the rock isn't big, it doesn't have a surface area of 4 by 4 cubits. It's also not 10 tfachim high. It doesn't have a name. Just a little beam sitting in your courtyard. Then it has not created a separate domain for itself. And since it landed close to her, even though it rolled away far from her, it's considered as if it and she are in the same place, and it's a good divorce. But if either of these conditions are met, in other words, the beam has a surface area of 4 by 4 amot, or it is 10 tvachim high, or it does have a separate name, it has separated a domain for itself, and we say that the husband only designated her 1 spot in the courtyard, not 2 spots, and the divorce is not a good divorce until it reaches her actual hand, because it rolled away and went to a different spot. This guy was practicing his pitching skills, and she's standing in her courtyard, and he chucks the get kind of like in a straight line like that, into her possession. Ve'avar b'soich rishusa shehi emedas ba, ve'nafal chutz l'rishusa. It passes through the entirety of her domain, but it lands outside of her property. We had a similar law when it came to Shabbat. Right? On Shabbos, you cannot throw an object from a private domain to a public domain, right? But what if you throw it and it goes through the public domain and lands in another private domain? Similar concept over here. So it went through her property, but it didn't land there. Even if the level at which it passed was less than 3 tfachim above the ground, typically, when you're within 3 tfachim of space, we say lavud. Lavud means attached. And it's considered to have landed, like for the laws of Shabbat. If you threw it and it was a low throw, once it reaches within 3 tfachim, it's considered to have landed in the public domain. Here, even though it passed through at a level less than 3 tfachim, eina migureshes ad sheyonuach birshusa. She's not divorced until it lands. It must land in her property. Because since the Torah says you put it into her hand, there has to be like a pudding. It's got to end up there. Halacha Yud Aleph. Hoysa imedas al gagazu v'zarkei la v'nafal begag acher samuch lai. She's standing on her rooftop of her house. You throw it to her, but it lands on the next door neighbor's roof. Now, in those days, it's important to remember how the houses were structured. They were very, very close, one next to another, and they were all on the same level. So you hear all these old stories of the shtetl. When there was a fire in one house, the whole city burned down. That's why, because they were all built in very close proximity. So she's on one roof, and then it lands on the roof right next door. If it's close enough that she can just stretch out her hand and grab it, harezu migureshes, she is divorced. Now, this is a novelty because it didn't land in her property. It landed on the other guy's property. Even though property is divided on top of a roof, like it's divided below the roof. In other words, if you have a house here and your next door neighbor's roof is over here, technically that roof is their property. The Rambam says, at least in those times, people were not particular about that space. If you had a roof, you could always use your friend's roof if it was close enough. Rooftop barbecue, you know what I mean? You could have a little party.
But the laws that got good.
So today, I don't think people would treat it the same way. I think today people would be more particular about their rooftop space. But in those days, it was okay. The houses are, they're separate properties, but the roofs are considered to be, as long as you can reach with your hand, it was considered to be okay. Halacha Yud Beis. This follows the same principle as the earlier case, where you're throwing downwards into her property. Hoysa yada ktafres. If her hand was stretched out at an incline, okay, so she's like this, it's kind of rolling downwards. V'zarak haget al yada v'nafal la'aretz. You threw the divorce into her hand, but because it's at an incline, it falls down. Im nafal l'seich arba ames shala v'nach. If when it falls, it stays within 4 cubits of where she's standing, and it comes to rest, harezu megureshes, she is divorced because it landed in her property. Nafal l'seich hayam l'seich ha'esh. If from her hand it falls directly into a fire or into the sea, eina megureshes, she's not divorced. V'hu, that is, shayisai medas al gabi hamayim esamuch la'esh, if she was standing right on top of the water or right near the fire, shemitchilas nefilas li'ibud ha'yo'emet, because then in that case, already in the beginning of its fall, it was destined to be destroyed. It's like a guy on the roof who's throwing down to his wife's property and he throws it into the barbecue. When you throw it directly into a space where it's going to be destroyed, that's problematic. Now, the Rambam implies that if it wasn't that case, if she was standing there with her hand down in an incline and it wasn't over the sea, you threw it, it fell down and then it fell into the sea later, it's implied that it would be okay. Halacha Yud Gimel. Zarkei la b'rshus harabe me b'rshus she'eina shel shneim. Let's say you threw the divorce to her in the public domain or in a property which was neutral. It didn't belong to either of them. Karev loy eina megureshes. If it's close to him, she's not divorced. Hoya haget mechza lemechza. If it was halfway between them, umi mechza lemechza ad sheyeh karev lo, or anywhere from halfway till it's closer to her, harezu safik megureshes. Here it's a doubtful divorce because here we're not sure if it actually has to reach her hand, or the fact that it's closer to her, even though it's the public domain, already makes it hers. Hoya karev lo. If it was so close to her that she could just bend down and take it, harez that puzzle. So here it's only rabbinically disqualified. Biblically, it's a good get. It's rabbinically disqualified. Until it actually comes to her hand, And at that point, she can literally use it to get married. Initially, it's no problem. In other words, the rabbis only said it's a problem for now. But husband can go pick it up and give it to her, and it's a good get. Halacha Yudalet. Ketadu karev loy. How do we define close to him? What do you mean close to him, close to her? What's close to him? It means if it's close enough that he can protect it and she cannot protect it. In case of somebody coming to attack it or steal it, he can be able to protect it. Zehu karev loy. That's called close to him. Shnehem yechelin l'shamrei. If they can both protect it or both can equally not protect it, zehu mechza lemechza, that's called half and half. And of course, close to her would mean where she can protect it. Now, let's talk about establishing jurisdiction. In the street, how do you establish what's your space? Bahu tchila va'amat. If he came to the street first, and he's standing there, the achar kach amda hi kinagdo, and then she comes and stands opposite him. And he throws it to her. So long as the divorce lands in a space that's within 4 amot of his, she's not divorced, even if it's so close to her that she can bend down and take it. Why? Because since he stood there first, he created the space around him first. The 4 cubits around them are his, to the exclusion of all others. But if the opposite is true, she stood there first. Then he comes and stands opposite her, and throws it to her, even if it's half and half. Since it's in her 4 cubits and she was there first, gets puzzle. It's now only rabbinically disqualified. Till the divorce reaches her hand, and then it's a good divorce. Halacha Tezayin. Zarak haget liyada v'haya kosher b'meshicha. You know those balls that they have, like, you can wrap it around your wrist like a little bracelet, and then you throw it and then it comes back to you. It's attached to a string. So he throws the divorce to her hand, but it's tied to a string, and he's still holding part of the string. If it's still possible for him to pull back and bring the divorce to him, she's not divorced till he snaps the string. But if he cannot pull it back, and here the commentaries argue, what does it mean he can't pull it back? Does it mean that it was so loose that you can't pull it back? Or maybe she's holding it tough and you can't pull it back? Okay, one of those two. The point is he cannot pull it back. She is divorced. Huh? No, then it's okay. But if it doesn't snap and he cannot pull it back, then it's actually hers. She's divorced. Yud Zayin. Nasan haget biyad avda v'hu neyar v'hi meshamartay. If you put the divorce into the hand of her slave, okay, she owns it. It could be like her property. So it goes like this: if he's awake and she's guarding him, im haya kafus harei ze get. If he's tied down, he cannot move on his own. That's a good divorce. Uki'ilu higel lachatzeira sheyemendas b'tzida. It's as if it reaches her property where she's standing. V'im einay kafus. But if he's not tied down, he's independently moving, einay get. It's not a good divorce, because even though it belongs to her, since he can move around at will, he has jurisdiction, not her. But if you put it into the hands of a slave while he's sleeping, so then her is a puzzle. It's only rabbinically disqualified. The rabbis were worried because you might put it into her hand when she's awake, when he's awake. But technically, biblically, it's okay. For sure, if he's tied down and sleeping, it's okay. It's a good divorce. That's all if it's her slave. Halacha Yud Ches, final halacha, kosav haget v'nosnei biyad avdoi. If I wrote a divorce and put it into my slave's hand, the kosav l'ashtar matana alav, and then wrote a document gifting the slave to the wife. Kevan shezachsa ba'eved, zachsa baget v'nisgarsha imaya kafus. Once she gets the slave, she automatically gets the divorce document, and she's divorced, assuming he was tied down and he could not move on his own. Being einay kafus, but if he's not tied down, v'neir, and he's awake, he has independent will. She gets the servant, but she must actually get the document into her hand. The acquisition of the servant doesn't require the divorce for her. A similar principle if he puts the divorce document in his own backyard, in his backyard, not hers. Then he sells her the courtyard, or gives her the courtyard. So long as she acquires the courtyard with a biblically binding acquisition, either with a document or with money or with showing possession, then indeed she is divorced, because it converts from his courtyard to her courtyard, And by dint of getting the courtyard, she also gets the divorce document.